Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Totalbiscuit. Alright, time for a port report on Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. Bear in mind, of course, that we're trying to get this out as early as possible so that people have as much information as possible going into the PC port. And this is very important considering the last version of Call of Duty was terrible on PC. Absolutely awful. So, needless to say, a lot of people are a little bit wary of the PC version of Advanced Warfare, to say the least. We're going to be having a look at options. We'll have a look at also at some of the single-player campaign performance. I'd love to show you multiplayer. That is currently not possible since it is not unlocked in this region as of yet. I'll be focusing on that at a different time, but I can show you things like the options available for multiplayer and single player, and then we can have a little bit of a look at the single player performance and see if there's anything that's completely off about that. So, options menu. This is quite surprising because it's a hell of a lot better than Ghosts. Firstly, nice to see, colorblind filter, always good to have that. Display modes available, full screen, borderless window, and regular window. With, of course, lots of resolution options. Will be nice to see a bit of a drop-down menu here instead of this toggle nonsense, but it's there nonetheless. Advanced video. This is probably the most detailed options menu I've ever seen in a Call of Duty game. This is actually kind of impressive. 24 different options. So, screen refresh rate goes up to 120Hz here on my 120Hz monitor. Problem is, multiplayer only syncs to 90 frames per second as a maximum. So, it will go up to 90, which is okay, but unfortunately, you may have some tearing if you don't use sync every frame or if you don't have a G-Sync monitor. Bear that in mind. Field of view. This is always nice. It does only go up to 90. This is still better than what Black Ops did, which is going up to 80, and I believe they put one eventually into Ghosts, but for the first few months of release, the game didn't have an FOV slider at all, meaning it was stuck at around 65, which made it very unplayable for those of us that suffer from simulation sickness. 90, I would say, is a standard amount. It's not an amazing amount, but it's a standard amount for PC games, and thus, as much as I would have liked them to go up to 100 or 110, 90 is acceptable. Monitor aspect ratio can also be configured here as well. And you can also change your render resolution. So this is reasonably important if you want to, say, run at 1080p, but you want to render it slightly below that because you have performance problems or anything along those lines. Basically, you've got an upsampling sort of thing going on with that, upscaling, which is obviously a technique that's often used on consoles to try and get higher resolutions than they can really render. But it's nice to see it as an option here. Texture quality. Now, this goes on auto by default. If you turn it onto manual, at least on my system, it defaults to extra, which is good because a lot of people set it to high and forget about it and then suddenly realize high actually means 720p quality, as in console quality. That may have changed this time around, but we've got extra here on that. And each of these, by the way, is giving quite a lot of information as to what it does on the right-hand side, which I find, again, particularly impressive. That's the mark of a decent PC port. Texture resolution. Normal map resolution, you're learning here, aren't you? Look at that. More lighting variation across bumpy surfaces. Specular map resolution. This is what specular mapping does. Anisotropic filtering. Low, normal, and high. I would have liked to see this use the standard designation rather than low, medium, and high. I don't know what low, medium, and high means. Or I do know what 4 times, 8 times, and 16 times mean, though, so maybe they should have included that. So I couldn't tell you what high means. I assume it's 16 times, but I'm guessing. Shadows. Or not. I just like you can just turn them off. That's hilarious. Yeah, just turn off all the shadows. There you go. I imagine some people might actually do that for competitive reasons, but you never know. And then you can fiddle around with your shadow map resolution here. Again, I'm not hugely keen on having these very nondescript presets like low, medium, high. I like to see something a little bit more detailed, but when it comes to things like shadow map resolution and texture resolution, maybe it would be a little bit tricky to give full information on that. And then you can do things like turning off the sun shadow maps, or more importantly, caching them, which again is nice. And it also tells you how much dedicated video memory you've got down the side here. It had a recommendation of having quite a lot of VRAM to have all of this stuff on, so just bear that in mind. Depth of field on or off. You can also mess with screen space ambient occlusion. 3 settings available right there. Medium distance ambient occlusion. Again, telling you what it does there. Subsurface scattering. And then depth pre-pass, which I'd love to tell you exactly what that does, but that is beyond my knowledge. Additional render of opaque surfaces is all it's really going to tell you there. Okay, now moving on to AA, you have several options here. So you've got FXAA, also known as the blurry kind of AA that a lot of people don't really like. You can turn it off entirely. You can also have filmic SMAA. SMAA is a relatively, it's not like ridiculously new, but it's a relatively new form of anti-aliasing. And you have a few different forms of it here, including filmic SMAA, which doesn't actually mean anything. To the best of my knowledge, that's not an official designation for that AA. And also super sampling, which is interesting. The fact that this game actually includes super sampling all the way up to 16 times is kind of crazy. We're seeing some games start to incorporate super sampling. We had that within Shadow of Mordor as well, and the idea is that it renders it at a higher resolution, even though your monitor maybe doesn't actually support that, and you get better quality as a direct result of that. You improve your image fidelity just on a kind of pixel by pixel basis. It has a reasonable effect, although it is very, very intensive, so just bear that in mind. Very intensive indeed. Outside of that, you can preload the shaders, which is going to be very nice if you wish to reduce your load times, and then you can turn off bullet impacts, and you can also mess around with the dynamic light limit. The maximum is 8 there. That is a really impressive set of options compared to what we're used to seeing from Call of Duty. That actually blows the other games out of the water, which is really kind of surprising. Now, if we head on over to control options, then you have individually rebindable keys, and you can also do things like have hold crouch and hold prone as toggleables if you happen to bind them, which again is also very, very nice. I'm kind of impressed to see that. We do have the occasional overlap in key rolls, although that doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. You're not going to be sprinting and holding your breath at the same time, so that's not really relevant. And you can even have things like hold strafe, which is actually kind of unusual in a lot of games. You can mess around with a lot of different presets as well, like auto weapon switch, auto mantle. Just in general, what I would say about this is that this is a very impressive key binding menu. It's got a lot of options. Smooth mouse is by default off, which is great. That's fantastic. You can even bind look up and look down to arrow keys if you're the sort of person that does that, and you can bind a key to center view and mess around with the mouse sensitivity. Inversion of the mouse is also available, and you have full text chat and voice chat support right off the bat, which is fantastic. And if you wish, you can use the gamepad, and it has some key layouts right here. Still same kind of problem with this. I really do dislike it when games do this. They don't actually let you individually rebind the keys, but you do have several stick layouts available here and several button layouts available. So that's not too bad. They do give you some decent options, and this is good for those, of course, who are left-handed as well. So that's very important, and you can mess around again with a set of controller-specific options. I mean, this is Call of Duty. I just want to remind you of this. This is Call of Duty that is actually giving you all of these options, and that actually blows my mind. That's a bit ridiculous. So, wow. That's a significant improvement from the previous games. Very impressive. The question is, I suppose, does it hold up in the game? And more to the point, how far can we crank it? As of the time of recording, this game does not support SLI, so we're just going to run it on a single Titan, and we're going to see just how far we can push this thing. All right, let's give it a shot in single player. All right, and here we are in the single player campaign. Now, performance, pretty good. And actually, quite surprisingly so. I'm getting around 80-90 frames per second for the most part. The frame rate appears uncapped in single player, so it'll actually go up to something like 140 at points. Bearing in mind that currently there is no SLI support, I'm running this with everything turned on to max with the exception of super sampling. Now, if I turn super sampling up, then that's going to knock it below 60, and that is, of course, because it's rendering a lot more pixels, a huge amount. So you are going to need a super rig in order to stay at 60 at that point. But even while I'm capturing at 60 FPS, which is quite intensive, I'm running right now at about 75, 80, 90. It's holding pretty much rock solid. So I don't have too many complaints here. And even kind of in a firefight, it's floating around 60 even while capturing. If I turn my capture software off, I'll probably gain another 10 frames per second without too much of a problem. So it's safe to say that in single player, the game runs, at least on my system, pretty damn well. However, I do have a couple of complaints, as I generally do when dealing with single player Call of Duty campaigns, and that's beyond the usual nonsense of, hey, it's holding your hand and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you know that's how Call of Duty works, and I'll talk more about that when I do a full video on the single player. But the problem that I have is that the field of view can't be customized in single player, and by my estimations, and I do have to guess, considering there's no real way to measure this, I estimate the field of view is around 65 to 70, and this was based on me kind of slowly turning, making a mark on the monitor, turning again, and then doing a little bit of mathematics. Not brilliant, frankly. Not too happy with that, and it probably means that I'm not going to be able to play the single player for anything more than short bursts. I really don't... Well, actually, I do understand the reason why they do this, because if you mess around with field of view in single player, especially when you're dealing with something that is very sort of cinematic and very scripted, you're going to possibly, if not programmed correctly, run into situations where you end up seeing the outside of things when you're not supposed to, yeah? It's like it's trying to control the camera very specifically, and it's kind of not letting you do that when you expand the camera's view. This is something that happened with things like Metro, whereby in Metro they had a situation where they said, right, you can change the field of view, but bear in mind in some cutscenes it might look just a little bit weird, yeah? Might look just a little bit strange. The thing is, I like having that option anyway. I'm willing to accept that some of the cinematics are going to look a little bit weird as long as the damn game doesn't make me motion sick, which games like this do. Second complaint I would have would be the fact that the gun models are, again, a little bit too big. This is very common with console ports. It's something that for some reason people just don't really consider. You don't want a very big gun model when you have a wider field of view and when you are using a monitor. It's generally very annoying, it gets in the way, and usually you'll find that good first-person shooters allow you to decrease the size of the gun model. In this case, you actually cannot do that, which is something of a disappointment. That said, a lot of us are probably not buying this for the single player anyway. I know I bloody well am not, so that's worth bearing in mind. But outside of that, performance seems to be pretty much rock solid, at least on my system. I'll be interested to see what, if anything, SLI support will enable. Maybe it will enable me to crank up super sampling and really increase the visual fidelity. But let's go lick a few walls, shall we, and have a look at texture quality. Is it any better than the previous Call of Duty games? Well, short answer is yes. Actually, it kind of is, although they use some fairly clever visual trickery to try and obfuscate some of the textures. You'll notice the wall is maybe not that detailed, but the nice, shiny specular mapping and things like that on the walls actually do make it look significantly better than it otherwise would. If we head over to some of the posters, they're again kind of sneaky because they put these interlacing lines on them, but actually the resolution's not really that bad on these things. It's a hell of a lot better than what we saw in previous Call of Duty titles going up to things like cloth textures. These do not look too shabby, all things considered. They could look a hell of a lot worse. So they do appear to have actually improved the quality of everything. I mean, this is not a bad wood panel texture, honestly, and the lighting effects are fairly good. This is a relatively impressive looking title. It's no Crysis 3, but it looks a hell of a lot bloody better than Ghosts did. That I can tell you for a fact. So, alright, okay, looks like this may very well be a next-gen Call of Duty, whatever that means. Mechanically, it's not too different, although you have the exosuit and this boost dodge thing, which I certainly do very much enjoy, and you can very much use that to avoid a lot of the bullets coming your way. Oh no, not all of them! Some, though. So I've got to dig that. I don't have to hide as much. I can actually boost around and dodge, which is just lovely. You've never been able to do that in a Call of Duty title. It's always been a case of, better hide behind this wall and regenerate. And that, frankly, is annoying. And this freedom of movement, I gotta admit, I'm actually kind of digging it. Huh. I wonder how this is going to apply to the multiplayer. So, yeah. Single-player performance, not too shabby. Hopefully the multiplayer component is up to snuff. I won't be able to test that until the thing officially comes out and the servers start to fire up in the US. But not too shabby so far, honestly. This is promising. I'll see you next time. That's not a bad little water bottle. Look at that thing. I can actually read the label.